This statute is enormous for all employers, including small employers and including private clubs. When the statute was first enacted in 2010, got a lot of attention, but I think most people, most companies, most businesses sort of put it out of their minds because most of the important provisions didn't go into effect until 2014. It's 4 years away. So the thought was, I don't know, I'll worry about it later on. Very big companies, I think, started looking into it, working with consultants, but most smaller companies, and certainly I suspect private clubs, did not do that and just thought we'll deal with it when the time comes. And then I think there was a thought that, well, Obama would be not reelected. There was at least leading up to that election, that was a thought throughout the country, and that the Republicans would take over and they would repeal the statute, and then no one would have to worry about it. And lo and behold, that didn't happen. And then there was a thought that the Supreme Court was going to overturn the legislation. There was actually in the legal community, a real strong thought that would happen. And a lot of attention in the press, and I think people thought, well, it's going to be declared unconstitutional, we don't have to worry about it. And then lo and behold, about a year and a half ago, the Supreme Court upheld the legislation in a 5-4 decision. So here we are, toward the end of 2013, and the legislation the important parts of the legislation are about to take effect. And all businesses, now again, some of it has been delayed. The employer mandate portion has been delayed until 2015, but there are many, many, many important things that are going into effect in just a few months. And this issue is especially tricky and important for businesses like clubs because you have a lot of oftentimes part-time employees as well as seasonal employees. And Steve is going to talk about this in much more detail, but that gives you some planning options when you have seasonal employees, part-time employees, as to whether they count in the number of employees that triggers your obligations under the Affordable Care Act. So this is something that if you haven't thought about, you need to be thinking about as you move forward, especially right now. So Steve, who's going to do most of the heavy lifting here, is the chair of Littler's Benefits Practice Group. Now Littler is a national firm. We have over 1,000 lawyers just doing labor and employment law on behalf of management. And Steve is our national chair, and he's a recognized national expert on the Affordable Care Act. I think he's one of the few people in the country that's actually read the statute and all of the regulations. And if you put that on the ground and stacked it up, it would probably go to about here. Very few people have actually read it. Steve has. He's been on top of the statute since it was passed. He's been advising our clients and speaking to business groups around the country for the last 4 years. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve so he could tell you what you need to be doing.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Kevin, for introducing some of the issues that we see legislatively are important for clubs. And as you had mentioned, clubs aren't necessarily in the crosshairs, but they're certainly getting hit by a lot of the issues that are of interest to all employers, and certainly with respect to the Affordable Care Act, there's an awful lot of things that folks in the club industry have to be focusing on. I do a lot of speaking to clubs and understand what some of your issues are, and I think there's still a lot of unresolved issues for clubs to deal with respect to the Affordable Care Act. We don't have a lot of time to talk about the Affordable Care Act today, so we're going to talk about just a few things. First thing is the pay-or-play basics in terms of what do employers need to do by 2015 in order to meet the rules. And in 2015, we know this was first legislated to take place in 2014, but was pushed back a year. You need to do what we call in the benefits business either pay or play. You have to comply with the rules or pay a penalty. There's two penalties, actually. One penalty is if you're not covering 95% of your full-time employees, you're going to have to pay a penalty that's $2,000 for each full-time employee, less 30. So if you were to have 100 full-time employees, you'd pay a penalty on 70 of them, $2,000. The penalty would be $140,000. There's a second penalty, and that penalty is if you are covering your people, but the coverage is either unaffordable or doesn't meet a minimum value test. And we won't get into what a minimum value test is right now, but that's something that your broker or actuary might be able to tell you if you meet it. But if you have coverage that's unaffordable, meaning that the coverage for your that you're offering for single coverage, it costs more than 9.5% of an individual's family income, then you get hit with another penalty if that individual who has to pay that amount can go to the healthcare marketplace, which is the government online portal that currently isn't working and that everybody's been reading about. Went online on October 1 and about 20,000 people have been able to sign up since then. It's this portal that anybody can sign up for, and if people who you're offering coverage to have income sufficient to where they're going to have to pay more than 9.5% of their family income for single coverage, they go to this portal and get coverage through the portal, set up in every state, and if their income is less than 4 times the federal poverty level, then they get a credit from the government. They get a credit from the government, and the employer then gets hit with a penalty of $3,000. So it's a $3,000 penalty for each of those employees that go through those steps. They have income of less than 4 times the federal poverty level, and the coverage that you're offering them is unaffordable. That certainly can hit the club community pretty hard, depending upon where wages are and whether people are going to these exchanges. So it's important to have coverage that will be robust enough so that you keep people away from these online, from going to the government and getting this subsidy and then creating a $3,000 penalty for employers. And by the way, 4 times the federal poverty level is not a low number for a family of 4. It's about $95,000. So lots and lots of folks are going to be able to get these subsidies, and it could create a lot of work and a lot of penalties for employers. So what's the big challenge for clubs? Well, the big challenge for clubs, I think, is determining who's your full-time population. As John had mentioned, we know that there's a lot of people who don't fall into a traditional full-time category as a club employee. You may have seasonal employees, you may have part-time employees, you may have employees whose hours go up and down, what we call variable hour employees. And you're allowed to count the hours of these folks and determine if they are or are not full-time employees. Unfortunately, from what I understand from speaking to clubs is that the way you might categorize someone as a seasonal employee might be different than the way the government characterizes them. The government characterizes a seasonal employee as an employee generally working during holiday seasons for about 3 months. You folks probably categorize a seasonal employee as somebody who's working 8 or 9 months. And if you have those employees, we don't know whether in the final analysis you're going to be able to call them seasonals or not. Most likely you will not be able to call them seasonals, and if they're full-time employees working 30 hours a week, you're going to have to sign them up now, or in 2015 for health care, even though they're not going to work for you for the full year. If you have people who are seasonal employees, though, or if you have part-timers, or if you have people whose hours vary, you are allowed to count their hours on a monthly basis and see if you have an average of 130 hours a month that they're working. If they are working over 130 hours a month, then they're considered full-timers and they're in. If they're working under that amount, then you can exclude them from your coverage for the full year, no matter how much they actually work, during the year in which they're excluded. So when's the best time to start tracking those folks? It's right now. It's October of 2013 to September 2014 would be a good time to track those folks, track them for a year. then decide who's in your plan in January of 2015. It's a very critical concept. A lot of folks are thrown off by the fact that the Affordable Care Act doesn't take effect for employers till 2015. The reality is you should be tracking hours now for a full year of anybody who might not be a true full-time employee. Wait for regulations to come out, but have the information ready so that you'll be able in 2015 to know who's in and who's out. There's some other issues that are facing clubs as well as other employers, which greatly impact who they should be covering, and basically who's in their workforce. There's a big push to have employees who work under 30 hours a week. Now, there's some legal problems though. If you have full-timers, we have a lot of employers coming up to us every day and saying, I have to get my full-time population down. I have too many full-timers, I'm going to put them on benefits. Especially if you're not including part-timers now on your benefit plans, and your part-time definition is over 30 hours a week. A lot of folks have part-time definitions of 35 hours a week or 32 hours a week, and all those folks are full-timers under the Affordable Care Act. So we see a lot of pressure by employers to get their health care costs down, and we see lots of employers saying, we're just going to take employees, take them from an over 30 an hour a week schedule, put them on an under 30 hour a week schedule. That may be illegal. It all depends how you do it. As Kevin mentioned, everybody should have some type of representation going into the healthcare reform process, making sure that what they're doing is legal and that they're not going to have any problem down the road. In addition to putting people on a 29-hour work week, we're also seeing folks rotating employees, putting in tenure limits. These strategies may or may not have legal problems, but it's something that is maybe doable if you do it the right way. There's also job or employee sharing, where an organization will say, okay, you're going to only work for me 28 hours, and you work for somebody else for the remainder of your work week, and organizations share employees so that neither of them has a lot of full-time employees and more part-time employees. Hiring insured people, something we see, is probably something that shouldn't be asked of folks at an interview. It can lead to legal liability, but we see certainly some pressure on organizations to try to hire folks that aren't going to take their insurance. The biggest issue that we see, I think, is in the club industry, is everywhere in America. When you look at businesses, is the use of independent contractors. If you're using independent contractors, our advice for years and years had been in the employee benefits business, there's no problem using independent contractors. Just make sure you exclude them clearly in your plan language from eligibility. If you did that, you would not have a problem. Under the Affordable Care Act, you have a problem. Here's the problem. You're covering 95% of your full-time employees. You have a group of folks who are contractors, leased employees on a third-party payroll doing other things. The government comes and takes a look at your plans and says, you know what, those folks should be classified as your full-time employees. And all of a sudden, you fall below the 95% of coverage test. And now you owe a penalty of $2,000 per full-time employee. You're not just paying that $2,000 per head charge on the folks you're not covering. If you fail that test, you're paying that $2,000 a head charge on every full-time employee you have, over 30 employees. So you have to be very careful, and often we're suggesting that folks that have a lot of contractors look very, very carefully at those contractors, make sure that they're actual contractors, and if they're not, to classify them as employees and consider covering them. We're also seeing outsourcing to staffing firms. This may or may not work. The staffing industry is now involved very heavily in Washington, making sure that the rules work so that organizations can safely outsource to staffing firms and not face huge legal liabilities. So, in short, what should you be doing now? You certainly should be not wasting a lot of time waiting for 2015. You should be planning now for 2015. Who's going to be eligible for health benefits? Will you change the composition of your workforce? If you do, be very, very careful. We'd be using more part-time employees. We change your benefit plan structure. You know, you have to have this plan that's cheap enough, that's affordable enough, so that you meet the rules, so that, you know, people aren't going to be paying more than 9.5% of their family income to get single coverage. But if you do that, that plan in itself might not be good enough for everybody else you want to cover, so you might need more than one plan. So it makes sense to think about your whole benefit structure and whether you want to change that. Some folks are going to self-funding. Some people are looking at what we call private exchanges. There's a mix of new insurance products out there that's coming to employers in connection with the pending changes in 2015. When you shift your cost to employees, you know, a lot of folks are saying, well, we're not going to offer coverage at all because we'll pay that $2,000 penalty. It'll be less than what we're paying today. We'll let everybody go to the government exchange. We let everybody go to the government exchange, and then if their income is low enough, if they're earning less than 4 times the federal poverty level, which isn't a low number, about $95,000 for a family of 4, about half that for a single person, then they can get this great subsidy from the government. The government basically is paying for their health care. Lots of folks are thinking about shifting the paradigm that way. So, you know, think about if your plan is going to be affordable, if you're going to offer minimum value coverage that's going to meet the rules, or if you're going to push more costs onto employees. There's lots and lots to talk about this with respect to the Affordable Care Act. John and I will be here during the break, but you know, those are just some of the things that clubs should be thinking about. So, thank you.